In 1831, 60,000 emigrants were welcomed into Quebec, a city whose population at the time was a little over half that. Later that year, however, news spread of an epidemic of Asiatic cholera in Europe, and this worried the Canadian authorities. They even debated the possibility of blocking immigration altogether. Of course, that was impossible. So in February 1832, the Assembly of Lower Canada decided to set up an immigration station on the St. Lawrence River. The place chosen for the immigration station was an island called Grosse Ile, 1 mile long by half a mile wide, situated 30 miles downriver from Quebec. The ship's sound between it and the neighbouring island is deep with a good clay bottom. It was estimated that 100 sailing ships could lie at anchor there in comparative safety. The Quebec Gazette of the time called Grosse Ile a pretty place and noted optimistically that if dejection be a cause of cholera, we think that those detained there may find a way to get rid of it. Officially, 5,500 Irish lie buried here. Unofficially, perhaps 2 or 3 times that figure. From its beginnings as a quarantine station, the island has been under military control. Their first task was to build houses for doctors and nurses and crude hospitals, known as sheds, for the immigrants. They also installed some cannon to remind any defiant ship captains that they must stop and anchor for inspection or rue the consequences. By a combination of brutal economic and legal measures, the majority of the people of Ireland were reduced to an illiterate, propertyless class by the early 19th century. Mass emigration to the New World seemed their only hope of betterment. Hundreds of passengers were crammed into crudely converted, rat-infested ships. It was said you could tell an immigrant ship by the smell. Food and fresh water were always scarce and could run out on a long passage. Once a contagious disease got hold, survival was a matter of good fortune. Cholera was first reported at Grosse Ile on the 9th of June 1832. 15 cases were recognised, 7 ending in death. By midsummer, 1,000 sick were being held on the island, and 1,800 on ships in the Sound. The shores were littered with sick and dying. The authorities couldn't cope, and they let ships upstream without inspection. 600 died on one day of August in Quebec. The boatmen who brought emigrants cleared of quarantine to Quebec tied up their boats and fled. The stench of bodies rotting in the torrid heat filled the air. It was a terrible summer at Grosse Ile, only eclipsed by Black 47. The failure of the potato crop in 1846 upset the miserable economy of a whole people reduced to one staple food. The misery was compounded by wholesale eviction for non-payment of rent. One of the most pathetic aspects of the whole 1847 story is the hope of the many tens of thousands who left Ireland, leaving behind famine and depression, to travel across the Atlantic in search of a new life. And having got here to Canada, all they found was death in an unmarked grave. Father Momigny, a French priest working here, wrote in his diary for the 16th of June 1847, "I, the undersigned, have buried in the cemetery of this place the following: Patrick Booth, aged 5 months, Judith Darcy, aged 5 years, John Booth, aged 40 years, and 44 others unknown." port of exit and date of sailing. Ship's rig, name and captain. Number of passengers, cabin class and steerage. The vast majority of these were Irish. No vessel was allowed sail upriver without a certificate of health from the authorities here on Grosse Ile. If anyone on the ship had been sick or had been in contact with the contagious disease, the captain had to hoist a blue flag and anchor here in the Sound. On one day in May 1847, there were 30 ships moored here, carrying about 12,500 passengers. Nearly 1,000 had died at sea. On the 1st of June, there were 1,000 fever victims waiting on the ships and over 1,000 on the island. By July, there were 2,500 sick on Grosse Ile, and the system had broken down. Father Bernard McGarren wrote to the Bishop of Quebec that May. "My Lord, the St. George has just anchored near the ship where I had been hearing confession for 4 hours. I have recovered from my fatigue, not because I have rested, but because I have become accustomed to it. Deaths are increasing. Today, we buried nearly 50 from off the ships. I hope that things will be better. Please excuse condition of this letter. I am writing on board ship. I don't have time to go to the house."
You can argue all day about the numerical sources, and I'm not a statistician, so I can't play around with those things. But when you read the letters of the priests to the bishop, you can rely on the accuracy of what those men are talking about, and there they're talking about the horror of the conditions on board the ships, where sometimes the ship comes in with only the captain still alive, and even the sailors have caught typhus and died. And once the ship came into the St. Lawrence, they ceased throwing bodies over the side as a form of burial. So the ships came into Grosse Ile with many, many bodies on board. And there was, at the beginning of the summer, there was no pier. So the ships anchored in midstream and lighters went out and the bodies were taken off. So you have some very, very vivid descriptions of horrible things, actually.
The few who were able to come on deck were ghastly, yellow-looking spectres. No more than 6 or 8 were able to exert themselves. Hundreds of people were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and the stones to crawl on dry land. I saw 37 people dying like fish out of water.
In the sick quarter there were 12 hospitals. This one is the only one still remaining. They were crammed with hundreds, if not thousands, of suffering typhus victims. The medical staff and the clergy were really overstretched, working long hours, and the facilities grossly inadequate. Father Taschereau, one of the priests working on the island, wrote to the Bishop of Quebec, "My Lord, according to Mr. Symes, there are about 1,200 people sick, about half of whom await the last rites. Most of them die as soon as they receive the sacraments and are replaced by others. Yesterday, there were about 55 burials in all. There are sick people aboard every ship, probably about 1,000. And even a glance into any of the hospitals reveals heart-wrenching scenes. Fathers McGoran, McDevitt and McGurk will all be too weak to resist the disease much longer. I dare ask your grace to do the impossible and send 3 more priests, at least for a few days." New hospitals had been built on Grosse Ile in preparation for the 1847 season, but it wasn't long before the overcrowding became so acute that the army had to put up 36 tents. When they were filled, the chapel was taken over. In the end, people just lay in the open.
From every side, people are asking for food. And when you see how thin most of these poor wretches are, you have no doubt that lack of food is the principal cause of all their sickness. Between 4,000 and 5,000 so-called healthy persons left Grosse Ile last Sunday. 2,000 at least will fall sick somewhere before 3 weeks are over.
The area near the hospital was policed by soldiers, whose job it was to keep the healthy from visiting the sheds and thereby spreading contagion. Many died alone, without the comfort of family or friends. Roughly 10% of the immigrants were Protestant. 2 of the 15 Anglican clergymen who ministered here caught typhus and died. Both the Anglican and Catholic communities maintained a presence on the island throughout its immigrant history. The oldest monument on Grosse Ile pays tribute to the bravery and devotion of the medical men, to the memory of Dr. Benson of Dublin, who died in this hospital on the 27th of May, 1847, Dr. Alexandre Pinet of Varennes, Dr. Alfred Mayo of Verchères, and Dr. John Jemison of Montreal, age only 34 years. These gentlemen were assistant medical officers of this hospital, and all died of typhus fever, contracted in the faithful discharge of their duty upon the sick. The official report for the summer of 1847 says that 5,426 bodies are buried on Grosse Ile. That doesn't include the many thousands who would have died here and there in the woods or on the shore and are buried where they fell. Bodies are buried in the sand in Cholera Bay. They did that when the tide was out. When they came to dig the graves for the dead, or should I say the trenches, the bodies were piled in one on top of the other and covered with a small amount of earth. However, within a short time they found that rats were burrowing into the graves, desecrating the bodies. And so shiploads of earth were brought in to protect the remains. Part of the graveyard has been cleared of undergrowth in recent years. Each cross represents 100 burials. This indeed is a special place, a focus of the Irish Holocaust. At the highest point on the island, called Telegraph Hill, there's a Celtic cross with the main inscription in Irish, English and French. Sacred to the memory of thousands of Irish emigrants who, to preserve the faith, suffered hunger and exile in 1847-48, and stricken with fever, ended here their sorrowful pilgrimage. Erected by the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America and dedicated Feast of the Assumption, 1909. Many thousands who passed through Grosse Ile were either carrying the disease without showing the obvious signs of illness, or else they contracted it here, only to suffer the effects later in Montreal and Quebec. There were a lot of hospitals set up to cope with this epidemic. Among those who contracted the disease while tending to the sick were John Mills, the then mayor of Montreal, 18 religious, and 25 priests, who are remembered here in this memorial. In the summer of 1897, the 50th anniversary of the famine, the Ancient Order of Hibernians visited the island. They were moved to collect funds for a fitting monument to be erected 12 years later in 1909.
In the reportings that I've read, there were present quite a few French-speaking people who had been brought up, who knew that they were Irish-born, but had been brought up in French families and had in completely French villages, who had never had a chance to learn English, and but were present, very much present there at this particular event, and perhaps had their own story to tell. My grandfather left Ireland 10 years after the famine, had recollections of it himself, and was very conscious of what had happened here. And there's a certain bitterness in what he has to write and say at the time, but the monument certainly expresses the gratitude that the people felt for the role of the priest and the role of French Canadians in general in this welcoming of what it must have been a horde of people, and sick people, and they were taken care of.
Mariana's grandfather, Jeremiah O'Gallagher, from Macroom, County Cork, organised the erection and dedication of the Celtic Cross. The ceremony included Mass, attended by 9,000 people.
There must have been a great number of them who had actually been on the island themselves as little children and who were now getting an opportunity to return. Quebec City had received and did adopt quite a few children. Some of them must have been present at that event. It was only 50 years after the event, and the children who are in the lists are from ages of a few months to 18 years. Even if you were 18 then, 50 years later, you're not too old to get on a boat and go and see the place. If you can bring yourself to do it. You know, if there's not such an element of horror in it that you can't touch the thing.
80 years later, another generation has chartered a ship from Quebec to Grosse Ile to pay respect to their emigrant ancestors.
I understand that my great-grandfather came over in 1847, the time of the troubled times. He came over on a boat and probably perished somewhere between Ireland and Montreal, where the boat eventually landed. Boats, most of them landed in Montreal. And he probably died at that time during the trip somewhere. My great-grandmother has survived.
On my mother's side, my maternal great-grandfather, according to family tradition, buried both his mother and his sister at sea during the voyage over.
I came here today in memory of my grandmother, whom I knew very well as a young boy. She was a great lady. She was born on a ship on her way from Ireland in 1857. She was born on June the 25th and baptized here on Grosse Ile on July 7th.
The Bosco, I think they call them, the Don Bosco brothers. They taught us when we were very young about this place, about all the bad things that happened here, and never to forget what happened. Mostly the sad things. There was nothing happy about the place. They were all told us every day we'd pray for them in class. And it was really touching. And even today, you come here and you feel things. If you visit the area where they're all buried, and you get very touched. And I've been here 3 times now, and I'll keep coming back.
Cardinal Vachon, Archbishop of Quebec, celebrated Mass on board ship. It was to be in the open air like the Mass in 1909, but wet weather made that impractical. Various gifts were prepared for the offering. Leo Tai, whose great-grandmother died in 1847, presented a basket of potatoes in memory of the famine victims.
Aujourd'hui, la charité du Christ surplombe et enveloppe ces lieux. Et un même souvenir remue nos cœurs.
In his sermon, the Cardinal remembered the people of Quebec who had taken to their hearts the Irish orphans left without father or mother in a strange country thousands of miles from home. He remembered too his predecessor, Cardinal Taschereau, who, as a young priest professor in the seminary, spent his summer holidays ministering to the sick and dying on Grosse Ile. And the deep faith which the Irish brought, strengthening the life of the church in Quebec. Between the years 1831 and 1860, 437,000 Irish men and women passed through this ship's sound. This was almost half of all the immigrants arriving to Canada during the period. For the famine year, 1847, 17,000 are recorded as having died on the Atlantic crossing and were buried at sea. 39,700 perished here, or shortly afterwards in one of the Canadian cities upriver, Montreal, Kingston, Toronto.
Pale victims, where is your fatherland, where oppression is law from age to age, where the death plague and hunger and misery rage, and tyrants a godless warfare wage against the holiest rights of an ancient land? Where the corn waves green on the fair hillside, but each sheaf by the serfs and slaveling's tide is taken to pamper a foreigner's pride. There is our suffering fatherland. Where broad rivers flow 'neath the glorious sky, and the valleys like gems of emerald lie, yet the young men and strong men starve and die for want of bread in their own rich land. And we pile up the corses heap on heap, while the pale mothers faint and the children weep, yet the living might envy the dead their sleep, so bitter is life in that mourning land. Oh, heaven ne'er looked on a sadder scene, earth shuddered to hear that such woe had been. Then we prayed in despair to a foreign queen for leave to live in our own fair land. We have wept till our faces are pale and wan, we have knelt to a throne till our strength is gone. We prayed to our masters, but one by one they laughed to scorn our suffering land. A million a decade, calmly and cold, the units are read by our statesmen sage. Little they think of a nation old, fading away from history's page, outcast weeds by a desolate sea, fallen leaves of humanity. A million a decade of human wrecks, corpses lying in feverish sheds, corpses huddled on foundering decks and shroudless dead on their rocky beds. Nerve and muscle and heart and brain, lost to Ireland, lost in vain. A million a decade, count 10 by 10, column and line of the record fair. Each unit stands for 10,000 men, staring with blank dead eyeballs there. Strewn like blasted trees on the sod, men that were made in the image of God.
Il y avait aussi beaucoup de citoyens en Québec et dans d'autres parties du Canada qui ont ouvert leur cœur et leur raison.
After leaving the island, the Irish ambassador to Canada, Edward Brennan, spoke to the group who had made the pilgrimage.
Sur cette île. To all of these people, known and unknown, of humble station and high estate, layman and cleric, to all who aided and succored the destitute Irish immigrants of 1847 on this island and off it, is due an immense debt of gratitude. On behalf of the government and people of Ireland, I should like to pay tribute to their memory. They will never be forgotten by a grateful Irish nation.